In a previous exercise, you may recall how as we expanded the 3D scene by increasing the height and the size of the ceiling, we also, or at least it appeared we also moved, repositioned those infinite light sources. And I was telling you that that's not actually something you can do in Photoshop. You can't move infinite light sources. You can just point them in different directions because, after all, they're infinitely far away. So what gives? Well, Photoshop is actually relocating the light sources in order to maintain the existing lighting inside the scene, but it also messes up the numerical parameters, which can be a little bit confusing when you go back to try to make some modifications. For example, inside of this scene, I would like the moonlight to expand beyond the bedspread here in this pillow region onto the nightstand. And so that means I just have to slightly decrease the angle of the light as it comes through this window. The light needs to be a little bit shallower. So let me show you how that works. I've saved my progress as 3dpostcardceiling.psd. It's found inside the 16ADV light folder. And I'm going to go ahead and bring up my 3D panel. And I'll twirl close both of my meshes, bedroom and shield 1. And then I'll click on Moonlight, which is the last light in the list before we start seeing the camera angles. And I'll also go ahead and grab my light tool. And bear in mind, you need your 3D light rotate tool. 3D light pan and slide have no effect when you're working with an infinite light because you can't change its position. However, seemingly Photoshop can, because look at these orientation values. They are now completely different than they were before. I had you enter an X value of -165, a Y value of 35, and a Z value of -58, and all the values have now expanded quite significantly. Well, we still need to change the angle of that light. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave ray tracing on, which is something I advise you to do when you're experimenting with light angles inside of Photoshop, because otherwise you really don't know what you're doing. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to leave ray tracing turned on, which is very useful when you're experimenting with infinite lights because you're not placing the lights in physical positions. It's not going to help you to get different camera angles, really. It's not going to help you all that much to Option or Alt click at a specific location in order to refocus the light as you do with spotlights. Rather, your best tool is to just make some modification and then see what happens as Photoshop renders the scene. And I know that's not the greatest tip on earth, but that's the best tip I got for you. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to go wide so we can take in the entire scene at a time by switching to the camera tool. Then I'll go up to the options bar and change the view setting from home position to my second favorite here, very wide angle, which allows me to take in the entire scene. And I am going to go ahead and let it render, even though I haven't made any real modifications to the lighting, just so that we can see what's going on from a distance. So I'll go ahead and press the escape key here because this gives us an idea of what's going on. Notice we have a light coming in through this far window on the right-hand side of the scene onto the floor. So we've got a big, huge highlight over here on the right-hand side. We're not going to see that when we're zoomed in, but it's interesting to know it's there. And then you can see that little bit of light on the pillows, not so much over here on the end table. All right, let's go ahead and address that. Grab that light tool again, and once again, it's the 3D light rotate tool that you want. And I can see that moonlight is selected here inside the image window. So I'm just going to go ahead and drag it. And notice that I'm dragging kind of in the opposite direction that the light is going. I'm dragging up and to the right just ever so slightly. And right about there, I'm just eyeballing things based on my experience with this image. Right about there is what I want. And sure enough, that gets some light pouring off onto the end table. All right, so that's good news. I'll press the escape key in order to stop the render. And I'm going to zoom back in by selecting that camera tool and then going up to the options bar and changing view back to home position. And that, of course, is going to cause Photoshop to re-render the scene. We're working in the draft mode at this point in time, so it really doesn't take all that long. You just go ahead and let it do a couple of passes. And in fact, there's no reason to let it do a pass down here at the bottom of the image. All we care about is this region right here. It's looking pretty darn good, but I'll tell you what, just so that you and I are getting exactly the same results, I'm going to have you enter some numerical values. Click on Moonlight, once again inside the 3D panel. Select your light tool, whatever it may be, and here's the values I want you to enter. And surprisingly, even though we're going to make just a very slight modification, these are very different numerical values, and they're just ones that I came up with through trial and error. I don't pretend to understand what's going on specifically with these numerical values. By the way, when you're dragging with that 3D axis inside the axis widget, even if you just make modifications to the green gadget or the red gadget, you end up affecting all values up here in the options bar. So I'm going to click once again to stop the render, and let's change that Z value to -120.5. and then press the Enter key or the Return key on the Mac in order to update that ray tracing. And even at this point, after just a few passes, you can see that I do have a fair amount of light pouring over onto this end table. I also have this interesting line that's being cast by part of the frame here diagonally across the end table as well, which I quite like. So this is the effect that I'm looking for. Go ahead and press the Escape key since I have that figured out. You also might notice the position of the red, green, and blue gadgets here inside the 3D widget, just to give you a sense of what's going on. All right, that takes care of the light coming in the window. In the next exercise, we're going to introduce a couple of new models into this scene.